Emma Goswell, and I'm your host for Coming Out Stories. So we're a podcast from What Goes On Media, and every fortnight we bring you real-life stories from fabulous individuals who just happen to be part of the wonderful LGBTQ plus community. So if you want to find out more, please go to our website, comingoutStoriesPodcast.com. And if you think you've got a story that might help or inspire others, why not put yourself forward to be interviewed? You can email us via our website, or if you want, you can message us on X, where we are at Come Out Stories, or on Instagram, where we are Coming Out Stories Pod. Right, enough of that. It's time to meet this week's awesome interviewee. Ben Green is a young trans activist and speaker, and as of very recently, he's a published author too. He's just written the rather brilliant book entitled My Child is Trans, Now What? So I sat down with him to find out all about his life and work.
So I came out about a decade ago in 2015. I was living in small town Connecticut. My town was like one store, one stoplight, tiny town. My high school had 800 people at it. So I came out, and the word spread pretty quickly once I had decided I was ready to come out publicly. But my childhood, it was very funny. You know, people expect me to have had this very stereotypical childhood of, oh, I always knew I wanted to be a boy. I was so masculine. Like, no, it wasn't that I knew I wanted to be a boy. It was just that I knew I was bad at being a girl. I was just weird. I was a very strange child. I got invited to a princess dress-up party, and it wasn't that I wanted to be a prince. I wanted to be Stitch from Lilo and Stitch, who's a little blue alien with 6 arms. And, like, it was very interesting. So I was like, okay, I'm just bad at being a person. I'm just strange. And then I started to go through puberty and had more of these thoughts of like, oh, wow, I hate what's happening to my body. This does not feel right at all. And then I started to feel more of what we would now call gender dysphoria. At the time, I had no language for it. I just knew that I felt like I was not in my body, which was terrifying.
So would this been like sort of the 90s then? Are we going back that far? Or?
No. This was about 2013. People think that I'm much older than I actually am. I'm 24, so I was born in 99.
So when you were a kid growing up, it was the noughties then, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess even then in the noughties, you know, things have changed a lot, haven't they? There's a lot more visibility for trans and non-binary people, but, you know, there was still very little in the noughties, wasn't there? You wouldn't have had role models, would you?
Yeah, there was almost nothing. I mean, it was really like, especially as a kid, none at all. And that made it really hard to come out because I didn't know that it was allowed. I didn't know that was a thing people ever did. And if there were trans characters on TV shows, I always say like victim or villain. Those were the options for trans people for a long time. So I didn't know that trans people could grow up or, you know, get married or have jobs or be happy. Like I didn't really know that there were normal trans adults living their lives out there in the world.
And would you say it's fair to say that probably trans women are more visible?
Yeah, I think definitely some of the highest profile trans people are transgender women. And like, listen, they're fantastic. I love Laverne Cox is amazing. You know, there are some really phenomenal trans women actresses, advocates, and I love this community lifting each other up. And it was really hard as a young trans man to say like, who is like me? Who am I seeing? You know, if a trans man can grow facial hair or have a wife or be like, wear a cool suit. There were very few, and even still are, honestly, very few trans men and trans masculine kind of visible people.
So what was it like then being a kid? Did you think perhaps, oh, I'm just a tomboy like a lot of your friends might have been?
Yeah, honestly, I didn't. I just was like, I'm just kind of a nerd. I don't really want anything to do with this whole being a girl business. Like, I just want to read The Warrior Cats, which were about cats fighting each other in the woods. It was a super weird book series. I just kind of wanted to read my fantasy books and hang out with my very, very small group of friends who also kind of just identified as weird kids. There were people who were tomboys. I didn't fit in with them either. I was just kind of odd.
Was there an expectation though from your parents to, you know, to wear the dresses? Because I mean, I certainly identify as trans. I identify as a cisgendered lesbian, but certainly as a child growing up, I couldn't bear the thought of wearing dresses or skirts, and I had so many battles with my mother in terms of what I was going to wear and how I was going to present. Were you having the same sort of problems?
Yeah, so it's actually really funny that you ask that. I wasn't. My sister was. My sister, who now identifies as a cisgender woman, for a lot of our childhood, I was like off in the corner being very weird, pretending I was a wizard. And she was like, yep, I'm going to be a boy when I grow up. I would like to wear a suit to this wedding. Like, please don't make me wear a dress. She was doing all that. So when I came out as trans, my whole family was like, wait, sorry, what? Wrong kid? What's going on right now? So they were trying to support her by modeling that inclusive behavior for all of us. So they were like, yeah, you all can wear what you want, your husband or your wife, because we were at the time 3 girls. So they said, you can marry who you want. I think they didn't really know what was going on, but they were trying to be supportive for her. And then I was taking notes and I was like, oh, okay, cool, fine. So I mostly wasn't getting forced into those boxes because they were trying to support her, which ended up inadvertently supporting me in coming out. And she ended up not coming out and being like, yeah, that wasn't actually it for me.
Funny. That's really unusual, isn't it? So what sort of things were you wearing growing up?
Patterns, mostly. A lot of checkerboard pants and a bright yellow shirt and suspenders with glitter on them. That was my favorite outfit. Like weird clothes. I wasn't really wearing girl clothes, air quotes. Wasn't really wearing boy clothes, air quotes. Like I was just weird was the best word that I had. It wasn't really dresses. I did not like dresses, but it wasn't like I want to be in a button down. Originally, once I came out, I love a good button down. But for a while I was like, yeah, I don't like being compared to other girls because I know I'm going to fail in that competition. So let me just opt out entirely and just wear leggings that had a picture of like a lightning storm on them.
But it sounds like you found friends, you had your people, you had your own group who supported you, no?
For those listeners at home, I'm making a very dubious facial expression. Yes. I had a couple of people. At no point did I have no friends, but I wouldn't describe myself as having a lot of friends. But I definitely had some people around me that I'm really grateful to, who many of them fell into that same kind of outsider bucket that I did for a variety of reasons, not just a number of them have since come out as LGBTQ or as trans, but also people who just were like a little bit nerdier, a little bit more quiet, all the outsiders kind of get lumped together. So I was friends with a lot of the people who had been kind of cast out a little bit or had opted out.
And was there a sort of a moment when the dots joined and you thought, this is why I'm an outsider, this is why I'm different?
Absolutely. So it started first, actually, I came out as bisexual when I was 14 because we were all going through puberty and starting to have our crushes. And I had always not really had crushes on boys. So I would pick I feel a little bit bad about this, but I would pick the boy that I thought was the least likely for anyone else to have a crush on him. Because everybody was always like, who's your crush? Who's your crush? And so I would pick the boy that I thought I was the least likely to have any competition over, not to go and ask to date, but just so that there wouldn't be anybody who'd be like, well, Ben likes the boy I have a crush on, so now we're fighting. So I would just kind of make something up. And then I started to have crushes on girls. And I was like, all right, I don't know if this is normal. So I started going around to my group of friends and saying, all right, scale of 1 to 10, how pretty do you think other girls are? And they were all like, I don't know, like a 2. And I was like, oh, so not like an 8. That's not normal then. And they were like, oh, no. So I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm bisexual. Came out to my family and my friends, and they were generally really supportive of that. And then I got added to a Facebook group for LGBTQ youth across the whole state of Connecticut. Again, not really a big state. Every town is a small town. So there were only 2 or 3 LGBTQ kids in each town. And so we found each other across the state in this private, underground Facebook network. Only high schoolers were allowed in, and we had a lot of safety procedures to make sure we were all taken care of.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was really cool. And we had debates and would meet each other. I met my first girlfriend through that group.
Oh, wow. Oh, no, I didn't even think young people use Facebook anymore. This is enlightening.
Oh, yeah. This was in the heyday of Facebook. Yeah. 2013, 2014 was the big moment that Facebook was having. Then somebody in the group posted that they were transgender. And I had this moment of oh, my God, everything makes sense now. And I came out pretty quickly after reading that.
So you actually came out as bisexual first, and what was the reaction to that, to people that you told? Did you tell family and friends?
Generally, it was really supportive because I think there had been visibility to LGB people before. So everyone was like, yeah, I've seen a gay person. I've seen a lesbian. All right, fine. You're telling me you want to date other women too? cool, I can understand what that is. I had seen them react to that before, so it was also easier for me to come out. Like my parents, we watched Modern Family every night, which is a sitcom that has, a gay couple.
I love Modern Family. It's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah, it's awesome. And it was great to know that my parents didn't have a problem with Cam and Mitch being a gay couple. And we laughed at the funny situations they'd be in, but we wouldn't laugh when they came out or when they got married. We celebrated those moments. We loved the characters. And so I knew that they were okay with gay people. So I said, if I come out as bisexual, they're probably going to be fine with that. And generally they were. They didn't, I had girlfriends. They were supportive. They helped me come out. That was really lovely.
This is not about you, but I'm just still not over the fact that the actor that plays Kevin is actually straight. I think it's quite incredible.
Oh my gosh, I know. Eric Stone Street is a professional.
Isn't he? He's quite incredible. Okay, so that was that, and that went quite smoothly, but I'm guessing you probably thought, once you twigged that you were definitely trans, that's going to be a harder conversation to have with family and friends, right?
Yes, because, first I couldn't come out because I didn't know it was possible. I didn't have the language. And then even when I said, all right, I know who I am, I didn't have any of those same supports. There are no casual sitcoms about the trans experience like that. I had no way to see them react to trans people. And that was also around the time when Caitlyn Jenner was coming out and everybody hated her. Now I've learned for good reason because she's kind of just the worst. She's not a great person. Yeah. But the way that people talked about that was by disrespecting her trans identity. And they had never talked about another trans person. She's the only trans person anybody's talking about. So that's the only piece of evidence I have, which is, all right, everybody hates her. Seems like they hate her because she's trans. Guess I have to assume that it's not safe for me either.
It's such a shame, isn't it? Because she was so high profile and she just wasn't a good role model for trans people, really, was she? She didn't even seem to support other trans people, did she?
No, not at all. She definitely has, gone pretty hard against the trans community in most cases, which there are a very, very small handful of like 2 or 3 famous trans people who are not in support of the trans community. So that was really hard because she had an opportunity to change a lot of the public opinions. Right. And instead, I think she made a lot of people kind of regress in their support for the trans community, which is really hard.
What a shame. So I know the answer to this because I've read some of your book, which we will come on to shortly, but how did it happen then? How did you, get the courage to tell another person that you were trans, and how did it come about?
Yeah, so I first came out to a group of 3 friends, my best friend, my girlfriend, and my best friend's girlfriend. And the 4 of us were kind of like a unit. So for the first year of my transition, I was only out to those 3 people. And I would not have survived that year if I hadn't come out to those folks.
How old were you then, Ben?
I was 15. Yeah. So it was scary. I had just turned 15. And I was pretty scared. And just very, very lonely. To feel so profoundly unseen by everyone in your life is exhausting. And so ultimately, I went through some really, really dark mental health times. And then actually I got into a car accident. It was not major, but it wasn't good. Like the car was pretty messed up. And I got home and I said, well, nothing's ever going to be scarier than that. And I decided that it was time to come out. And I realized that I just couldn't afford to keep living inauthentically anymore. And so I came out to my parents, and then later on I came out to my friends at school and posted on Facebook coming out and decided to be, really open. But it was definitely scary to decide to do that, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to.
And I wonder if you hadn't had that sort of near-death experience or a bit of a wake-up call if you'd have done it as soon.
Stay where you are. We'll be right back.
I have an overall fascination with making sure sex workers' history is retained in some way because everyone else gets to know everyone else's story. And I feel like the people who are most deserving of that preservation of story feel like they have to die in silence in a way.
Well, we see the deepest, darkest secrets of men. And their desires and their fantasies and their issues too and their phobias. Yeah, I think working girls do a lot of work they don't even realize,
Madam, a podcast about Julie Moya and New York City's most famous brothel.
Yeah. I think I was approaching a breaking point just because because I didn't feel like I wanted to live anymore. I will share openly that I struggled a lot with, suicidal thoughts and depression and anxiety because I just, nobody saw me as I was. And that was a really lonely way to feel. That was really scary. And so I was just waiting to know, okay, people see me now. Is it ever going to be possible for me to be seen, to be happy, to live as I am? And so I think I was getting to a point where I said, if I'm not going to be able to do that, I don't know if it's worth it anymore. And so I was definitely approaching a point where I was like, I need to come out.
For your own sanity, for your own mental health, absolutely.
Yeah. Even if whatever I might lose, I can't stay where I am anymore.
And you mentioned that one of the first people you came out to was your girlfriend. I mean, that must have been particularly tough because, there are people who have lost their partners because they've come out as trans, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Oh, yeah.
Did it go okay? Did you get the response you wanted?
This girl, to her credit, I mean, we'd been on like 2 dates. This was not a serious relationship, but I trusted her. I knew that she identified as bisexual or queer, so I knew that she was had historically been attracted to both men and women and non-binary people. So I wasn't like, okay, I'm identifying outside of her identity now. But I definitely was nervous about it. But because I had kind of talked to her as I was questioning, it wasn't as much a coming out as much as it was hey, here's something I'm going through right now. And so she kind of honestly was amazing. I mean, I could go over to her house. She also told her parents. She told her mom and her brother. And so I could come over and when I ordered my first chest binder, I ordered it to her house because I couldn't get it in the mail at my house. And then her family let me wear a tie to dinner, and her mom called me Ben, and that I had a space I could go most weekends where I knew that I was going to get seen as I was honestly really outstanding. She was my first real serious partner. Hannah, if you're listening, thanks for everything. She was really spectacular. We dated for about 6 months, and it was really nice.
Well done, Hannah. That is amazing. And then it was a while later when you told your own parents then and were able to order stuff to come to your own address, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. Once I came out, I always say they did the absolute best they could with the resources that were available to them at the time. They didn't know what that meant. And that's a really hard thing. We can't expect people to have perfect reactions right away because there's a dramatic increase in visibility, not an increase in education in the same way. So many people have no idea where to even start to learn. So they said, all right, we don't understand what this means, but we love you, so we're going to figure it out together. And that took some time. It wasn't like a perfect, easy process that was completely flawless. There are things that I could have done better. There are things that they could have done better. And there are things that they did do better that I said, hey, this isn't working for me. And they said, okay, cool. And we evolved our relationship. They both put a lot of time and effort into learning, which I am so grateful for. Overall, now they are totally in my corner, super excited about the book. It is pretty awesome.
It does take a while, though, doesn't it? I think even today, for people who come out as LG or B, let alone the T or non-binary, it still can be difficult for parents, can't it? So how did you do it? Did you sit them both down?
Yeah. We all were living together. So I sat down with them. Once my sisters went up to bed, I said, hey, I need to tell you guys something. I am transgender. I have felt this way for a while. And at first, actually, they hadn't understood. I had come up with this analogy to explain being in trans that I had presented as a project in my health class that I hadn't explained why I cared so much about, trans people yet. And I went to my therapist and I said, all right, I came out to my parents. I don't think they really get it. My therapist knew I had come up with this analogy and been teaching it to my health class. And she said, well, hey, do you want to have them come in and you can teach that analogy to them? So the initial conversation, truthfully, I only remember bits and pieces of, because most of it was just kind of them asking questions and saying, we don't entirely know what this means, and me sharing, that's why I've been seeming really depressed and, wearing more button-down shirts. And I have this thing called a chest binder that I wear sometimes because that makes me feel better. And they were like, yeah, we have noticed that and wondered what's been going on. So I met with them with my therapist and I walked them through this presentation. They were like, okay, this actually makes a little bit more sense now. And so they, slowly learned. My mom does a ton of research privately. She loves to read books and read a million articles and watch every TV show episode she can find. And my dad wanted to talk about it all the time. So we would have, go for a drive and I would explain what non-binary means or the difference between bisexual and queer. And, they each learned in their own way, which was also really cool. There's not one way that's like, all right, you have to learn that way.
They sound pretty cool, your parents, I have to say.
Yeah. They're pretty cool. I'm pretty lucky.
Let's talk about the coming out to your class, though, because I read that in your book, and I just thought it was pretty unique, really, to do a presentation to, all of your peers at school.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that came about and what happened.
So I came out at school. Basically, I had this health class presentation about gender identity that I had given as for your junior year, you just needed to make any presentation about a topic that was important to you and present it to your peers. So I made mine about trans identities and understanding and allyship, and I gave it to the class. And then the teacher said, hey, we don't actually have any inclusive trans education for the other grades of health class because sophomore year is human sexuality. So that's when they talk about condoms and, all that fun stuff. And I said, we don't have anything about trans inclusion and identity in that. And that seems pretty important. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to lie. It would have changed a lot of the course of my life if we'd had some of that inclusive education. So they said, all right, that sounds great. Would you be interested in presenting to the sophomore health classes? And so all of a sudden I'm as I am in the process of coming out to my peers, I'm going and giving these presentations to all the sophomore health classes of all right, here's what it means to be trans. This is my story. And it was pretty cool to get to share that with so many students who would then come up to me privately and say I think I recognize something in there. And so my parents called me the Pied Piper because nobody came out in Weston without talking to me about it first.
Well, that's it. So at your school, you were the first. You were the trailblazer at your school, weren't you?
I don't actually know. I know that there was at least one other trans student that was out before me, but he didn't want to be writing the policies and doing things. He just wanted to be allowed to exist as he was, which is also super fair. And I suspect there were others before, but I was one of the first that I knew of for sure.
And I like the way you did it. You sort of gave a whole presentation and said, and I know this because I am trans. Mm. And what was the reaction from your classmates?
Mostly a lot of excitement. I think the area that I'm from is an area with a lot of wealth. And with that comes a lot of showiness. So there's very little authenticity among high schoolers, especially in a place where it's all about being the perfect girl and the perfect boy, getting the right shoes. And it was very performative. And I think the fact that I had come into this class and said, consequences be damned, I'm going to come out, whatever's going to happen. And that radical authenticity people really liked. So mostly I got a really positive reaction. And I always think it's so funny because I was not popular. I did not have very many friends, as we've talked about. After I came out, I was Mr. Popularity with the girls, not with the boys. The boys wanted nothing to do with me. They did not like what I was doing. And not necessarily from a dating perspective. Everybody wanted to be my friend, though. All the girls were like, who's this guy? He's so cool. So all of a sudden, I got tons and tons of friends. And I asked somebody about it recently. I was like, why do you think I got so popular? And she said, honestly, because you were just so real. And most people were not, said, I'm going to wait until high school to get to figure out who I actually am and not just the roles I have to play in this town. And I was saying, whatever the consequences are, I'm going to do it now. And people really liked that.
That is fascinating, isn't it? And how do you think the school dealt with it? Were they good? Did everyone respect your pronouns? Were teachers good at, calling you by your chosen name?
Yeah, what I'd say is that definitely my teachers, I'm so grateful that people were on it about names and pronouns. And a number of my teachers even said how do you want me to handle peers using the wrong name and pronouns? Do you want me to correct people? So they were on it. I think the administration, again, did the best they could with the resources they had available to them. They were really passionate advocates. And if I came to them and said, hey, I realized that we don't have, this inclusive curriculum. I noticed that our guidance staff isn't equipped to support trans students. I noticed that we don't have this policy. They said, oh, do you want to help us with that? So it was very cool. And it was a lot of responsibility to be this kid. And I became an adult overnight. Immediately, I had to be really well educated, really well spoken. And that's a lot of pressure to put on a kid.
It is. And how old were you then? So they're still young, weren't you?
And I was 16.
Yeah, that is a lot of pressure on a 16-year-old.
Yeah, and if you could think of any 16-year-old would you describe them as patient? That's not a category people put teenagers in. But
No.
For trans kids, okay, you have to be really patient if you want to get support.
And I read something interesting in your book as well. You talk about the pressure of being asked about it. And to begin with, you absolutely relished it. And of course, it's a big responsibility and you're helping educate the rest of the school. But then there came a point in your life, I think, where you're just I'm done. I've had enough conversations. Can you explain that process of why you wanted to stop after talking? You were like, enough already, weren't you?
Yeah, there was a point where the only thing, I was so popular, and I realized that one of the only things people were asking me about was my trans identity. I'm so much more than that. I'm a huge nerd. I love my dog. I love my family. I've got all these interests and passions. But people didn't want to know about that. They wanted to know about the trans thing. I started feeling like a trans person who happened to be Ben, and that was exhausting. And so I said, I'm going to go to college, and I'm not going to tell anybody I'm trans because I can't handle being everybody's first transgender friend anymore. And then I went to a liberal arts college in Boston, and everybody was like, yeah, of course I have other trans friends. And I was like, oh, here I can be Ben who happens to be a trans person. So I did come out and continue to educate people because I knew that they saw me as more than just a fill-in-the-blank trans person whose only personality trait was being trans. Like, I was a whole person, and occasionally it would come up, and occasionally it wouldn't. Most of the times it wouldn't. I got to be in, theater was most of my activity. It wasn't being in the queer student group. It was performing, which, I don't know, some could say that that's also the queer student group, but that's beside the point.
So you weren't actually in the closet for very long, were you? And that was probably a better place for you. But you can understand why some people just don't want to come out as trans, can't you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's terrifying. And I'm really fortunate that I lived in a fairly liberal community. Now I live in Missouri, which is not a supportive community for many people. St. Louis, the city I live in, is a bit more liberal, but it is really hard. I mean, there's so much misinformation. There's so many reasons that people use their faith or their misunderstanding of science to say, I'm not going to support you. I completely understand why so many people just can't afford to guess wrong about their families. For so many people, it's not necessarily the presence of clear malice as much as it is the absence of clear support.
I mean, I talked to a lot of people on this podcast about being out at work, and I think you're one of several people I've spoken to, and I put myself in this category as well, sort of, where actually the fact that you're part of the LGBT community has been your work, has been your drive, hasn't it, really? And the fact that you're out and very visible as a trans man has led you to go on to be a speaker and now a writer. And how important has that been to your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely originally was in school for elementary education. I wanted to be a third grade teacher. And then I had an opportunity to give a TEDx talk that totally blew up. And all these companies were like, wow, that was so cool. Do you do this professionally? And I was like, oh, sure. And my catchphrase has always been, I try to maximize my good. I go wherever I can do that's going to do the most good. And so after the second of these corporate speaking events, I was with my dad and I said, I think I've got an opportunity here to do a whole lot of good. I know I could do well as a teacher. I know I could really impact my students and my community. And if I go into public speaking, it's a leap into the dark, but I think I've got a chance to do a lot of good here. And so I graduated early and in 2020 set out full-time to do public speaking and inclusion advocacy. And I haven't looked back. My work is built around my story, which at times is really challenging, can be really draining, can be really personal, and is so meaningful because I can see the impact that telling my story has on all the people around me.
Yeah, absolutely, which is kind of why we do this podcast as well, because actually sharing our stories is so helpful to people that haven't been on that journey yet. And I think for you, it's more about educating allies, isn't it? I think for you, that's probably the thing that you're most passionate about, isn't it? Am I wrong?
Absolutely. I spend a ton of time with allies. I love talking to a day one ally who's, all right, I guess I'm ready to start. My catchphrase is the only question I won't answer is the question you don't ask. And I just can see when people go from being so afraid to say the wrong thing to slowly saying, all right, I'm curious, I'm excited, I'm ready to learn.
So tell us about the book then. Remind us what it's called and how it came about to let us know that.
Yeah, so I've been working on this book in some way or another for 5 or 6 years now. I came up with the idea in 2019. So it's been a while that I've been thinking about wanting to write a book. And in 2020, I started to get a lot more serious about it. And the subtitle of the book, I think, is so key, which is the whole title is My Child is Trans, Now What? A Joy-Centered Approach to Support. Because I do a lot of coaching for parents. I didn't mean to set out to do that, but I would do all my corporate speaking engagements, and then parents would call me and say, literally the subject line would be a whole lot of the time, my child is trans, now what? And I was like, okay, let's talk about it. So I'd get on the phone with them and they'd often say, I bought all these books, but they all assume that I'm going to be upset. And, they're all really negative, or none of them are written by trans people. I went and looked at all the books and I said, gee, you're right. Like, most of these are not written by trans people, or they have a lot of judgment for the reader, or they say, you have to do this because this, like, none of the books were really what so many of the parents I was talking to were looking for. And so I said, all right, I can write a book. So I started to put together an approach that really centered my story as a transgender person, rather than centering the parents. It says, hey, this is not about you. This is about your kid. How are we supporting them through it? And how are we really focusing on joy? So much of the way we talk about trans people is as a very miserable community. People are surprised that I'm so happy-go-lucky, because they just expect trans people to be really sad and really oppressed. And, the TV shows we watch are only ever sad trans sob stories a lot of the time. So it's really about building an approach to support that keeps your kid at the center and is about joy.
And I love what you refer to, your generic term for referring to trans people or non-binary people. Go on, share it with the listeners.
Yeah. So originally in the book, I was like, all right, is this for parents? Is it for teachers? And it was getting really messy to write, like, okay, so when we're talking to your child, student, neighbor, etc., there are so many words you can use. So we're just going to say your VIP. Because whoever you've had in mind, this is the person at the center. So we're going to call them a VIP. So we remember that it's about them. That's who we're trying to support. That's who we're focusing on right now. And it's a fun way to make the language a little simpler.
And why was it important for you to write the book for parents as opposed to writing it for your younger self or for other young trans people?
Yeah, there was a phrase that I heard years and years ago that really resonated with me, which is be the person you needed when you were younger. I always say that I was jumping out of a plane with a tarp and a sewing kit. I was building all my support systems once I already needed them. And in a lot of cases, once it was already too late. So now as an adult, I want to be the parachute factory. I want to build those support systems so that other kids don't have to. I want to write this book and send it out into the world so that the next trans kid who comes out in a small town at 15 doesn't have to do all this teaching. He can say, hey, here's this book that you can read so that I get to still be a kid. I don't want to have to grow up. I don't want a trans kid to be brave or to be mature or to be patient. I want them to be curious and annoying and like explosive and exploring the world around them.
Well, this could happen, Ben, in the future. People could come out and go, I'm trans, and by the way, read this book, and hand their parent your book. That's your dream, isn't it, really?
That absolutely is my hugest dream, that I get to take that weight off somebody's shoulders. It really brings me a lot of joy. I'm always in my feels about that these days.
Well, I always ask people for a bit of advice, but I feel like you've written a whole book of advice, but and people can go and find that book. But if there was one nugget of advice that you think is the most important thing for parents of a trans or non-binary child to listen to, what would you like them to remember and think about?
I think it's two parts. It's the motto of my favorite organization, PFLAG, which is a lead with love. So the first piece of that is acknowledge that understanding can come on day 5, on day 10, on day 100, as long as love comes on day 1. You don't have to get every part of your kid's identity, nor do they need you to, as long as you are able to show up with love and respect and let them lead the way. The other thing I'd say is to remember that the person that is coming out, your VIP, whoever that is to you, that is still the same person that you love. They're just more comfortable. They have not died. They have not gone away. It is not a brand new person. That is still the same soul, the same human being. They look a little different. They might go by a different name, but you still know them. You still love them. Remember that.
That's so good. There will be people listening who, are trans or non-binary themselves and, haven't got the confidence, or they're not quite at the stage that you were at the age of 15. What would your advice be to them?
I always say a big thing is find your champions. Figure out who is on your side. Figure out ways that you can test the water. So whether that's having a supportive aunt who can help you come out. I had a supportive aunt in my family who helped me figure out how to tell my parents. Whether it's having a supportive teacher at school who can help you talk to the administration or someone at your workplace, or if it's another student, or if it's your sibling, figure out who is on your team. Find community. Do not do this alone. It can be so easy to feel like you are the first person doing this. You are not. You're not the first person in your town. Even if you're the first visible person, find other people in your area, whether it's through a community center, through an online network. You are not alone in this, and it's going to be so much easier if you don't try to reinvent the wheel. So find people who can have your back, who can give you strategies that have worked for them, especially if it's a local resource, is so helpful. But also national resources are amazing too. Don't go through it alone. Hang in there. Remember that your identity is not defined by what people do or don't call you and how they do or don't see you. If you see yourself as you are, that is enough for that identity to be true and real for you, and other people will catch up eventually, but that's not your problem. You know who you are.
Absolutely. And would you have any advice for maybe ignoring stuff that you read online? Because it's a pretty horrible world out there on social media, and I know trans people are at the brunt of a lot of hatred, especially in 2024, sadly. And it must really affect everybody that reads it. So how do you cope with that, and what advice would you give to other people trying to navigate social media?
It's so easy to feel hopeless, but I'll give a couple of important reminders. Social media platforms make more money the more upset you are. They have a financial incentive to upset you, to show you content that will make you angry, to show you content that will make you sad, to get you to fight with someone in the comments. That's a business model, especially for something like Twitter. I'm not calling it X, especially for platforms like that. They thrive on your pain. So be aware that it's not that every single person is hateful. It's that they're showing you people that are hateful because that's their business model. Most people out in the world, social media does not reflect how people feel. I constantly expect to find hate because of social media, and instead I find people who are curious and loving, maybe misinformed, but people are not as hateful as social media makes it seem. Even something like the news, which you would hope would be more neutral than social media, for every individual negative word in a news headline, you are more likely to click on and read an article. The news has an incentive to make you feel bad because you're more likely to read it. Good news doesn't get reported. Bad news gets blown up because you're more likely to read it. So get involved locally, get involved in your area so that you're in the room where it happens, and you can know that things are not nearly as bad as they might feel. People are not nearly as aligned against us as it might feel. In the US, we've got almost 500 anti-LGBTQ bills. That can be scary, but we had this number last year. At this point last year, 84 of those bills had passed. This time this year, 16 have passed. That's huge. These bills are less and less popular. People think they are an overreach, including people on the other side of the political aisle don't support these bills. Many of them are just kind of people being showy to get witnessed proposing these bills because they want to kind of show off to each other or activate their voter base. Doesn't mean that everything is good, but it does mean, hey, things are improving, and the news isn't reporting on that because you're not likely to click on it, but getting involved is a great way to learn, hey, here are the victories that we can be celebrating, because there are actually quite a few victories.
I love this. You're so level-headed, but also very optimistic, and it is the only way that we can get through life, I think, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, we gotta be a little more optimistic. We gotta stay sane.
Rather awesome Ben Green there, and his book is out now. It's called My Child is Trans, Now What? And as you can tell by hearing him speak, it is packed with real insight into what it means to be trans, and also great advice for anyone who's a trans or non-binary person in their life. I just love his opinions on social media too, don't you? It really isn't there to cheer us up or make us feel better, is it? He's a wise young soul. Right, make sure you stick with us for the next episode, because then you'll get to meet a gay man called Robert. Now, Robert is a children's author, but before that he worked in the West End, where he met his now husband in the most unusual set of circumstances.
So within that world of musical theatre, my husband came into my life, and we actually met working as Oompa Loompas at Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Which, yeah, I bet that's a sentence that no one's ever said on the podcast before.